So but I definitely was just letting you know ahead of time, whatever questions I have, just be prepared because I will ask questions.
All right. Yeah. So I'm here for everyone. All right. Paper, remind me, the paper for this class is due Friday. Is that it? Or is it next Monday?
You said March 1st.
I think it's next Monday.
Next Monday. Okay.
Did we have a discussion question for today?
You did not. No. Yeah. Today's the day we're talking about a bunch of different poems, and we're going to talk about a lot of history today. So nah, not for today. I'm probably not going to require one Wednesday either for the Shakespeare sonnets. Only thing I ask that you do is maybe, I don't know, like what if you find a poem that you particularly gravitate to, maybe like make note of it. Maybe make a note like why you gravitate to that one. Like why do you enjoy that one? Yeah, maybe just do something like that to prepare for class. Okay. So yeah, the next 2 days we're talking about poems, and after that, you guys should be able to begin. After these next 2 days, you guys should be able to begin your poem imitation assignment, which is where you write a poem in one of these styles that we're going to talk about. So, that can either be in the shape of an alliterative poem, sort of like the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, like 20 lines or so of alliterative verse, followed by a bob and a wheel. Or you can write one of these sonnet forms with the rhyme schemes and the meter and all of that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of days. So I'm going to go over that in great detail. A lot of the next 2 days, probably a lot of the next 2 days will be more lecture heavy than normal. Normally we spend a lot of time discussing. Next 2 days, I'm probably going to talk a little bit more than I normally do. Okay, just because there's a lot of concepts to go over. But as always, we can have discussion in the middle of lecture or whatever, right? Yeah, kind of like how we always do. So it's a big transition moment in the class because we're moving from the Middle Ages, medieval period, and on to the early modern period, the Renaissance. All right, so we're in a big point in the class. Anything else I can answer about papers or other class business before we get going for today? You guys seem good. Yeah, it won't be too long until our midterm. We have that in a couple of weeks as well. Once we get close to it, I will prepare you for it. We'll go over all the concepts that we've talked about and all that good stuff. For this class, we'll probably have to take the midterm on Blackboard. I'm going to have to actually consult with some other faculty to see how I go about doing that. I know they have the lockdown browsers and all that kind of stuff, but I'm going to have to figure out how to do that. That'll be how you'll take the exam probably. Yeah, that'll be in a couple weeks. So just to make a mental note of that. All right. So today, I want to first start out by giving brief sort of introduction to the Renaissance, early modern period. Then we'll talk about Petrarch and Sir Thomas Wyatt. Of course, as you guys might have noticed from the readings, Sir Thomas Wyatt adapted Petrarch into modern English. Okay. So at this point in the class, we now have what is the modern English language. Right? This is the modern English language. It might not seem that way because some of the word choices and the diction especially is more archaic compared to what we are used to today. But this is the modern English language. We have, the vowels, like if you read the pronunciations, all that type of thing is the same as it is today. At least in England, right? You guys know American English radically differs from the English in England. But it is the same language that we have today. So when we read Shakespeare, Milton, Christopher Marlowe, like all these writers that we're going to read over the next few weeks, it's in modern English. So at this point in the class, we've encountered all three forms of English: old, middle, and modern. Okay. Well, as I said, over a couple of 100-year period, from about the 14th century up to the 16th century, the language shifted. The vowels, it's called the Great Vowel Shift, right? But the vowels were now pronounced, the way that they are now. It's a long, intricate process, one that I'm not extremely knowledgeable about. That's a linguistics class sort of question. Linguistics people were the weird English professors, like they're like the outcast English professors, like no one talks to, right? That's who the linguist people are. So if you ever at a university, the person who teaches linguistics, they're the social outcast just because they're weirdos. Okay, but it is useful stuff. I'm just picking, right? But it's kind of true too. They study, but linguists are impressive people though, just because linguistics is more of a science than it is a humanity. It's a very scientific oriented. So even in an English major, taking a linguistics class is a much different thing than taking a class like this. Anyway, so that's the basic trend there as far as our language becoming more modern. So these couple of 100 years of history that we're sort of skirting over, there's lots of stuff that's happened historically speaking. We can probably begin with religion, right? As we've alluded to so far in the class, the Protestant Reformation happened in the 1500s, right? The Protestant Reformation. Of course, you guys know Martin Luther. We talked about all these different problems that the Catholic Church was undergoing when we talked about the pardoner's tale. Martin Luther nailed his edicts to the walls in Wittenberg, right? And that created a great, sort of split in the Christianity. Now we have the Protestants and the Catholics. And of course, as I said before, pretty much everything that is around here is Protestant. Right? There might be the one random Catholic church here and there, but everything that's not Catholic, besides Eastern Orthodoxy over in like Eastern Europe, right? Everything that's not Catholic is for the most part Protestant. So all these different denominations we have today: Baptists, Presbyterians, Church of Gods, right? Calvinists, they're all Protestants, but their doctrines slightly differ, right? So now we have this great split. And as far as the Protestant Reformation goes, it mostly took place, of course, it started in Germany, right? It went westward over into England. For the most part, it was a sort of Northern Europe phenomenon. Even today, France and Spain are both much more Catholic, right, than they are Protestant. That's just the natural sort of way the ideas spread. It mostly stuck to that region, right? So for even not to say that there aren't Protestants in France and Spain today, but still both of those countries are predominantly Catholic even today. But even in England, it's been a long, bloody history of Protestants versus Catholics. You guys know in Ireland is for the most part still Catholic, right? Of course, Ireland and England are always in conflict with each other because England's always tried to colonize Ireland. But one of the reasons why they are in great conflict is because the English have traditionally been Protestant and the Irish are traditionally Catholic. And it's created a lot of conflict over the years. But you guys know in the 1500s, this was in England, this was when the Tudor Dynasty of monarchs began, right? So we started out with King Henry VII. The Tudors overthrew the last line of kings, the Plantagenets. Okay, so we have King Henry VII and King Henry VIII. Was probably don't have to go too in depth about King Henry VIII as far as who he was. He's a cultural icon, right? You guys all know King Henry VIII, right? All of it. He had his many wives, right? He kept wanting to produce a male heir and couldn't, right? Then we had briefly after Henry VIII, we had a brief reign by his daughter Mary, Queen of Scots. And then we had the great English monarch, Queen Elizabeth I, after that. And Elizabeth I was the last of the Tudor dynasty. After that, we had the Stewart Dynasty, who takes over, starting with King James I, who, as we know, made the King James Bible. Right. So next several weeks, we're going to talk about a lot about Elizabeth and a lot about James, because this is when a lot of the sort of cultural production was beginning to happen with Elizabeth and James especially. But today, when we talk about Wyatt wrote his sonnets during the reign of Henry VIII. He was especially involved in Henry VIII's court in some detrimental ways, perhaps, as we'll see when we look at his poems. But this whole, going back to religion, this whole time period was marked with religious conflict. As you guys know, when Henry VIII was first king, England was still predominantly Catholic. Well, you guys know that when Henry VIII divorced his wives, or wanted to divorce or killed the wives even, right? The Catholic Church had problems with that because divorce has always been kind of a taboo thing in the Catholic Church. They're much more strict about getting divorced than they are in Protestant denominations. Right, so
could that be considered subjective? Because they don't really like divorce. A lot of my family members either.
Well, of course, right? It is looked down upon a lot, right? And even in some Protestant churches. But I think traditionally speaking, the Catholics are much more rigid about it. Like, it's very rare that you see a divorce happening with Roman Catholics. Like, it's very stigmatized. Some Protestants might be strict too, right? But especially so with Catholics, I would argue. You guys might know about President John Kennedy, right? John Kennedy was a famous Catholic. He had all the infidelity and whatnot, right? With he cheated on Jackie all the time, right? But that's one of the reasons why they never got divorced. It's because they were Catholic. If you know a little bit about presidential history there. he cheated with Marilyn Monroe and all these different women.
Do you find it odd that Bill Clinton was persecuted for sexual activity and JFK got away with quite a bit?
I guess it just didn't come out in the open during
Yeah, I think that's what it was too. Yeah.
JFK's tenure. Yeah.
Like Clinton's in the office, like literally in the office. Wouldn't it like something to do with that too? I don't know the whole Bill Clinton issue. I just know that he got in trouble for it. We didn't really get in trouble, but about got in trouble.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to sidetrack us here, but I think it's interesting because JFK is considered more of a rock star than a president sometimes.
Yeah, he's got that magnetic personality, right? He was young at the time when all the other presidents were old fogies before him, right? With Roosevelt and Truman and Eisenhower, right? Those were his three predecessors. Yeah, even today he has a reputation. He's kind of a bad president when you start digging into him.
I wasn't going to take it there, but
Right, he wasn't the greatest. He even
And as far as the divorce goes, if you think about the image that he tried to maintain, getting a divorce not only from the fact that he was Catholic, but just from the American people would have probably been a very taboo thing and would have made him his whole image be different.
There was a president who got divorced in the 1800s while he was in office. I can't remember who it was right off. He was one of those really obscure ones. Yes, in the 1800s, there was lots of these really obscure presidents that we don't really hear about much. I'll have to look. I'll get back to you on that. I'll tell you which one it was next class. Let me actually make a note. But yes, going back to the English, like I said, divorce is still very taboo with the Catholics. Dale, you can tell me about how it is with your family. You said that I know your uncle was a minister. You want to speak to divorce and?
I mean, they're just very traditional. You know what I mean? They look down on divorce. They look down on, and I hate to say look down because I'm kind of speaking for them when you shouldn't do that. And I'm not a Christian, you know what I mean? But that they're not even big fans of living like I used to have a fiance, and they didn't really like the idea of even us living together before we got married, which I don't care about any of that, but it's just interesting that they firmly believe in that.
Right, very entrenched old school social values, right?
Yeah,
They're Church of God, but they're First Assembly of God, which is very reminiscent of Church of God.
my family's big Christians, been raised like my whole life. I mean, I ain't a Christian, but I've been raised in it my whole life. And I could tell a difference though with my dad and my mama. My mama, when she's about like Dale would say about you can't live together and stuff like that, because she was more old time. My dad was more lenient on stuff like that than my mama was, but that's probably because of the generation she was raised in.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, because my uncle is more lenient, I guess, but my great uncle, he frowned even when I'd come around sometimes, and I mean, it's just
right. Yeah, it's always the conflict, right? The old school values versus the new progressive type of society that we're in these days, right? Yeah, so Henry VIII was interesting because the Pope told him, no, you can't get divorced. Right, you're stuck. He's like, well, damn it, I need an heir. Right. So what did he do? He said, well, he just kind of flipped the Pope off. Right? He's like, screw you, Pope. I will form my own church. Right? It's very childish, like on a playground, right? Oh, I'll just make my own church. Right? That's kind of what Henry VIII did. So he formed the Church of England, which is also known as the Anglican Church today. This isn't, unless you're in England, right? This type of Christianity is very unfamiliar to us over here in America. It is Protestant, but they still have many sort of Catholic ceremonies and whatnot. So like they're, of course, you guys know, like, passing around, like drinking the wine and all that kind of stuff, symbolizing Christ's blood, right? They're much more involved in those types of ceremonies than Protestants are over in the church, or than American Protestants are over in the Church of England. They have lots of ceremonies. Like I talked before about the Catholic Mass on Christmas, right? They're much more, the ceremonies are much more involved. They have a type of clergy class even within the Anglican Church. Whereas in American churches, Protestant churches, you have the minister, maybe the deacons, right? Well, there's bishops and all that type of stuff even in the Anglican Church. But that's what he did. He formed his own church, the Church of England. And well, that broke off into different sects, which I'll go into in a second. But so that's what he did. And he immersed England within this whole big religious conflict. And as you guys know, he wasn't able to produce a male heir. He had a male heir for a little while, Edward, but Edward didn't live long. He was very sickly. I think he died as a teenager. So for a brief 5-year period, his daughter Mary became the monarch of England. Mary, Queen of Scots, also known as Bloody Mary. Right? She was known as Bloody Mary because she openly persecuted Protestants. Right? She wanted to return England back to the Catholic Church. So that's a whole subject in and of itself. But lots of bloody, almost civil war type of stuff started happening because she started persecuting all these new Protestants. Well, she didn't last long as the monarch. Eventually, Henry's other daughter Elizabeth took over. And of course, she restored it back to the Anglican Church, and then the Catholic Church became sort of. It was still there, but even Catholics were persecuted a little bit during Elizabeth's time. Right? They were persecuted. For the most part, Catholics started going north up towards Ireland. Right? So this is the time period too when England and Ireland really start getting into it. Right? They've always been at each other's throat. They're still at each other's throat. Right? But this is when Elizabeth sent military in to try to suppress the Irish Catholics and all this type of stuff. I'm not the most knowledgeable person about this stuff because, like I told you guys before, I'm an Americanist. But I know the basics at least. Right, and this is the time period where all that was starting to happen. So what ended up happening in England, though, this is something that's going to be prevalent to the whole rest of her class. I told you guys the Anglicans are they're very Catholic in their ceremonies and stuff. Well, eventually a branch broke off called the Calvinists, right? Inspired by the theologian John Calvin. And Calvin argued, Calvin was the predestination guy, right? He argues that an all-knowing, all-powerful God has to know who's going to be saved and who's going to be damned. Right? He has to know. He's all-knowing. He's all-powerful, omniscient, and right. He's omniscient. Right? He knows this. So, well, he created this brand called Calvinism. And I told you guys before. He argues that humanity is completely depraved. Right? We're the worst. We're scum. We're scum in God's eyes. Right? So we should be, Calvinists pretty much argue we should be thankful, right, that God even allows just a few of us to become saved. And God gives His grace, right? He gives His grace. The people that He gives His grace to are called the elect, right? The elect. And I don't know why He came up with this number. Right, but he said there's actually very few people in the whole history of the world who are elect. And he came up with this number like 144,000 people in the whole scope of history will actually be elect. Right, a lot of the other people were pretenders. Right.
I think Jehovah's Witnesses actually still hold that belief that only 144,000 people are actually going to make it to heaven.
If they don't, it's something very similar in that idea.
Yeah, I don't know much about Jehovah's Witnesses. I'll be honest. I don't know a lot about them or what they.
You've never been visited by an advocate for Jehovah's Witnesses?
Well, my grandfather taught me a nice trick for when they come by. When they come by, just tell them that you're Catholic, and they will run. Right.
They're probably shunning you.
Yeah, they really don't like Catholics. So if you just tell them you're Catholic, and they'll be like, "Okay, have a nice day."
The only reason I know a little bit about it is because I had a buddy I went to school with that was Jehovah's Witness, and I felt so bad for him because he just couldn't participate in any type of celebratory events, including his own birthdays and Christmas. You know what I mean? Anything positive, because if I'm not mistaken, they believe that we're in hell right now and they should do their penance.
I also had a very, very close friend that was, he wasn't Jehovah's Witness. He hadn't been going long enough to actually be baptized in the church, but he held on to some of their beliefs. And I did something that he thought was bad. And, I'm not a Jehovah's Witness. I never was, never wanted to be. And he shunned me. That's something they believe in. If somebody in the church does something bad, you shun them for a whole year. Even their family won't talk to them, won't look at them, acts like they're not there to punish them. He did that to me for a whole year, never talked to me. And then when my year was up, he said, "Hey, how are you doing? I hope you're doing better." Just insane.
Yeah, I was talking about temperance the other day. I just always practice, like, even though his beliefs are out there, I still considered him a friend because we could still relate on a base level. You know what I mean? Without holding any preconceived notions or faults in our own beliefs.
Oh yeah, that's very true. And, I still love this person that I was friends with. I still consider him a friend, but I just wish he wouldn't have held me to the standards of his religion when I wasn't part of that specific sect of it.
Yeah, I remember there used to be a Jehovah's Witnesses church in Pineville. I don't know if there still is. There still is one. It used to be close to the 7-Eleven, I remember. But yeah, I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know a lot about them. That's something I need to read into a little bit.
A unique thing about them is that women are not allowed to open prayer or pray in church out loud. Like, they're not allowed to lead blessings and things like that.
I just don't know how anybody in this day and age could think that that's okay. I still, that's so archaic. Like, geez Louise.
Yeah, the Calvinists, like I said, they believe this 144,000 people number. So, like I said, Calvin's book is called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. It's very dense, like multiple volumes. But the whole thing, he quotes scriptures and goes over all his reasons for all of this. So he argues that the elect know because that they're actually saved, because there's that one time, right? When it's a lot kind of like how a lot of folks argue when you get saved now, right? There's a time God's always sort of poking at your heart, right? And there's a certain time period where you know, okay, I'm truly forgiven, right, for my inner depravity, right? God has forgiven me. He argues that it's just an inherent thing, you know, when you're saved, right? That the elect eventually know in their hearts that they are.
Can you become a Calvinist if you aren't in that initial elect?
Yeah, that's the question, right? They claim that they're elect, but are they? Right? I guess that's only a question God knows, right? But yeah, you can practice it, but I guess Calvin will argue even if you practice it, it's kind of like how we talked about before. There's some Christians who don't seem genuine, right? They're hypocritical, right? So you can practice Calvinism, but are you really saved? Calvin would argue no, right? Hence his very small number.
Gotcha. So everybody is fighting for their spots until the rapture or the end of days, or however you put it.
Pretty much. Like I said, there's as far as that's Calvin's beginning. A lot of his ideas are still in the Protestants, different denominations, but maybe that number has loosened up since then. Predestination is still accepted a lot within different Protestant denominations. But like I said, it's maybe not that strict now.
Isn't a lot compared to the whole world. So it'd be very hard to see which ones get to go. And so it'd be hard to do that religion just because of the, like, in my opinion, I'd be like, well, what makes me one of the 144,000? So that's literally rolling a dice on that religion, just hoping for the best, hoping that you're the 144,000.
Yeah, it is kind of very pessimistic.
I think that concept is a little just not right, because there are many times in the Bible where it talks about like God loving the world, and like John 3:16, most of you probably know it. Like, for God so loved the world. Like, he didn't pick just a few people that he wanted to save, like the world. I don't know. Like, I have a hard, and if that number is true, then we are pretty much wasting our time. Like, it pretty much means that we have no purpose, pretty much.
Can I mention something to y'all that I think is hilarious? There's a South Park episode where the end of times happen and they're all in hell, and it's all these different faiths. You got Muslims, Catholics, Protestants, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and they're all like, well, who got into heaven? And they're all standing around wondering. And there's a guy up on this podium. He says, hold on a second. I mean, look, he looks at this paper. He says, Mormons. The correct answer was Mormons.
That's pretty funny.
I don't do it justice, obviously. Like, it's hilarious.
That's so funny. It's funny because the whole reason that I was drawn to Mormonism when it was pitched to me by the missionaries was their idea of heaven. Like, their idea, there's not just one heaven, there are 3 levels. It's like whatever life you lived is the level that you go to, and like whatever you're most comfortable with. Like, if you're not comfortable being in the full sight of God and that close to him, then you're not going to be on the top level. And
wow,
there's
that's
not
really
like
interesting. I didn't know that. That's really cool, actually.
Another
Joseph
cool
Smith
thing,
aside, in his golden tablets, which is baloney, but
no, I agree. That was, it was a hard topic for me too. Another cool thing though, they don't believe in hell. Like, they don't believe that anyone in the world goes to hell. There's not a real hell. They do believe in outer darkness. The only person who's in outer darkness is Judas, who saw Christ and turned away from him, and that's what they believe.
It's a shame that we're not getting to talk about Dante's Inferno a little bit in this class.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that.
I don't guess there's nothing stopping us if we want to talk about him. We just with the acknowledgement that he's not British, like we'd have to just make that acknowledgement if we want to cover it for a day.
Listen, my cousin played a game that was called Dante's Inferno. I don't know much about it, but I do know there was a game that was out.
I've played the game. It's not very similar to the text, right? It's a bloody good time though. I'll say that about it. But if you read through Dante's Inferno, this relates to, of course, Dante's Inferno is written when there's just Catholics, right? The Reformation hadn't happened yet. But at the beginning of it, he goes into hell, and the first place he goes to is purgatory. The people he runs into are very virtuous, right? He runs into Plato and Aristotle, right? He runs into Hector from the Iliad, right? He runs into all these noble. He even runs into like some characters from the Bible, right? He runs into all these noble people. Well, but the problem is all these noble people existed before Christ was born, right? So despite the fact that they're noble and they were virtuous people, they're still in hell in Dante's Inferno, right? It's not a very, the hell in purgatory is life is just like it is on earth, right? You still have earthly pains, right? You still have hunger, you still have the desire for sex, right? You have all this stuff. So that hell for these people is just like it is in life as it is on earth. They still have these earthly inclinations. And the reason why Virgil, the poet, tells Dante the reason why is they just were born before God gave his grace, right? So their punishment is because they were ignorant of God, they didn't know God, that they can't be in heaven, right? So that often raises the question, right? Is that messed up, right? Just let's say that you're a Native American and living in 1100, right? You don't know who Jesus is, so why should you be punished for that, right? So that's often the question that's raised about Dante's Inferno, but that's very Calvinist. That's almost a very Calvinist sort of idea too, right? With the elect, and a certain number of people can only be saved, and all this type of stuff.
Another question that brings up as far as ethics goes is, if you're being good and you're being a good person simply for the reward of getting into heaven, does that make you a good person? Or does that mean you only did it for the reward? If there was no reward, would you have still done it?
Hey, that's something Jordan Peterson talks about a lot, is he doesn't necessarily believe in heaven, but he believes in the idea of believing in heaven because it sets you grounded and makes you a good ethical person. So I would argue, yes, it does, considering I don't think heaven's actually a factual place.
Yeah, like often I'll pick on my own mother here, right? Because she's not gonna watch this, so why not, right? But bouncing off of that, like she's always posting stuff to Facebook, like I gave this guy begging for money $10 today, right? Because he might be an angel in disguise, right? I'm like, is that the only reason why you gave a guy $10? Right? Does he think he might be an angel in disguise? Come on, Mom. Right, so.
Yeah, my mom does some stuff like that too. I think I love people that give stuff and then put it on Facebook. Like, yeah. I'm a good person. Look.
Yeah, she gets on my nerves a little bit, but I digress.
Yeah, oh, I still love my mom. Unquestionable.
So yeah, we're still talking about the Calvinists. But what ended up happening in England with the Calvinists, they eventually were also called Puritans, right? Because they also wanted to purify the Church of England. Like I said, the Church of England is very Catholic, so they wanted to purify it of its Catholic influence, its Catholic stench, so to speak. Right, so they wanted to get rid of a lot of these pomp and ceremonies. Right, we still see this today with modern Christianity. They wanted to get rid of the pomp and ceremony. They wanted to get rid of the music. They wanted to even like make the worship of God very simple, right? Simple and to the point. And get rid of this pomp and ceremony and all this stuff. The influence of all this wealth, right? They wanted to get rid of all this wealth and prestige. They wanted to cleanse the church of all that. So the Calvinists took up that even in like the ordinary worship of Christianity. And we still see that today, right? Different certain sects of Protestants, like you won't even have music in church, right? Because it's that strict. That's a very Calvinist sort of idea.
Are you saying that Calvinists come from Puritans, or vice versa, like the Salem Puritans, for instance?
So I was getting to that. The first colonists who went to America, right, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were English Calvinists who believed in this. We need to simplify the church and stuff like that. So they came over into America, right, in the early 1600s because they were persecuted in England because they were a minority. They were a very loud minority, though, but they were a minority. So they came over to America, wanting a place where they could worship freely without being persecuted by the Anglican Church. So America was founded on religious radicals. Right? Those were the people who went to not the Virginia colony. The Virginia colony is different. That wasn't a colony founded on religion. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by we had John Winthrop and his idea of the city on the hill. Like America's the shining city on the hill. We're going to be a moral example for the rest of the world to follow. Right? That came from these English Calvinists who left. And one of the main reasons why they left is they wanted to have simple church. Right? They didn't want to have all this pomp and ceremony. So, yeah.
I find it interesting that they came all the way over here to have their own religious freedom, but kind of wanted to push their own religion on everyone else and didn't want to give anyone else their own religious freedom.
Yeah, the irony is unsurpassed. It's insane, actually.
Yeah, that's a subject for early American literature class, but it is very true what you say, Nicole. Right?
Yeah, I'd be curious what you thought about like Nathaniel Hawthorne and his, because I think John Goodman Brown's like a satirical piece. I think he's mocking Puritans.
Well, you should join our other class one day, Dale. Mine and Nicole's other class. We just finished talking about old Hawthorne not long ago. The Minister's Black Veil. We just finished talking about that one. So yeah, but eventually, I'm glad we're just spending a day just talking about this stuff because it's going to be relevant to everything we read from here on out. But I guess that's a benefit of canceling the reading for today, right? Just so we could take our time. But eventually, this all led to the English Civil War, right? The English Civil War. What ended up happening was a lot of these Calvinists took parliamentary roles. Right? They became like the majority party in Parliament in the 1600s. So roughly up to about 1650 or so, right? So about that period between 1620 and 1650, like this is this great religious strife, right? The Calvinists, this radical group of Christians were now the majority. Well, the king of England, I think it was Charles. I need to check. I know after James, there was one or two kings after James before the Civil War happened. But the kings of England were very Anglican, but some of them were very Catholic, sympathizing too. So what ended up happening? The king, I need to look it up. I think it was Charles. But the king and the Parliament butted heads, right, hard. Like the king exerted his power, and the Parliament wanted to limit the king's power, and all this stuff. So eventually it came to the English Civil War. What ended up happening was Parliament ended up taking over England. So they had the king killed. And for a brief period of time, a dictator took over England. Right? He was called the Protector, Lord Protector. So you guys might have heard the name before, Oliver Cromwell. Right? Oliver Cromwell. He became the temporary dictator of England during this Civil War period. And our great poet, who we will read later in the class, John Milton, was almost his. I like to compare John Milton and Oliver Cromwell to Donald Trump and Kellyanne Conway. Right, Milton was almost his Kellyanne Conway. Right, Milton was Cromwell's sort of propaganda minister. Right, he was the one spreading the word, right, about how this is why Cromwell's such a cool dude. Right, he's the man. Right? So.
What would the QAnon of that day have been?
I don't even think all this bloody Civil War and all this stuff, I don't even think they were as crazy as the QAnon folks.
I'm not even going to comment because it's insanity.
So you guys know what they believe. We could take 2 or 3 minutes for this. You guys know what they believe that's going to happen on March the 4th?
Talking about QAnon?
Yeah.
I figured their whole idea got shut down when the shaman got arrested.
Yes.
It was so pompous that he got vegan, GMO-free meals in prison. That was just absolute bullshit.
Yeah, but they believe on March the 4th that Trump is going to become the president again. Right? It's an interesting reason why they think that. They think that we haven't had a legitimate U.S. president since U.S. Grant. U.S. Grant was the last legitimate president in the 1870s. Right?
Grant was involved with the Civil War, right?
Yeah. He was the great American general in the Civil War on the northern side. But yeah, they believe that they haven't had a legit one since then, because that was when we went off the gold standard. Right. So
define a gold standard.
What's the gold standard? Oh God, that's a whole complex subject. But that's how our money was made. Right. Used to be money was the worth of money was based on how much gold we had to back it up. Right. Well, 1870s, we realized there's not enough gold for the amount of money we need. Right. So that's when we started. If we ask ourselves now, just look at the back of a dollar bill. It says, "In God we trust." Right. So you might ask yourself, what's the worth of a dollar now? Well, it's based on the worth that we put into it, our faith in the dollar. Right. So the dollar is just a piece of paper, right? It don't mean anything. But its worth is based on the faith that all the American public put into it. right? So that's all it's worth, what we think it's worth. But it used to be that it was worth what we had in gold to back it up. We don't really do that anymore, as far as that goes.
There's even a lot of people that believe Fort Knox is empty.
Right. Yeah, we still have a little bit of gold reserve and all that, right? But our whole economy is not built on it anymore. But the QAnon folks think that. And they think that
They also believe in a deep state, right? And that a lot of our elected officials are pedophiles and all kinds of other crazy shit.
and
They believe that I think they believe that celebrities and some Democrats are vampires that feed off of the souls of babies in an underground tunnel network.
The March 4th thing comes from the presidential inauguration date used to be March 4th up until like the 1870s or something. And then they changed it to January 20th back then. So yeah.
How do they plan on accomplishing this feat?
It's just going to happen, man. It's just going to happen.
We're not supposed to know. We're simply supposed to witness it.
I don't know if y'all have ever heard of any like conspiracy theories, but it's called like frazzled drip. And it's the like Hillary Clinton and all these celebrities cut off the faces of babies and stuff. A ton of people believe that. I don't know. I don't guess I necessarily believe that. I think it's just interesting to hear how in depth they do believe it.
No, I agree with you in it being interesting because I think QAnon's batshit crazy, but it's interesting because I think it's interesting that they believe that.
Listen, speaking of conspiracy theories, y'all might laugh at this, but I did a 10-page research paper in high school on the Illuminati. I wrote a 10-page research paper on the Illuminati and how it was all started and everything. So, listen, the conspiracy theories are crazy, especially stuff like y'all's talking about.
I think the Illuminati's kind of took a back seat as of lately, but yeah, I used to be familiar with that idea too. I think it was like Beyonce and Jay-Z were supposed to be members, and all kinds of other crazy celebrities.
Yeah, it was about famous, like a bunch of famous and rich and powerful people was all like part of this worshiping Satan group or something like that. I know it came. Well, in my research paper, I do remember that the supposedly the Illuminati started when a guy who was in the Freemasons wanted out to so he could practice more satanic religion. That's what the story from behind. He was like in this book, like there was a book club is where it all started at, and this dude wanted to take, and he was a Freemason, and he wanted to take the people in his book club and start his own group, more satanic group, and that's what he did.
Yeah, I couldn't remember if it was Freemasons or Knights Templar, but they also say there's clues on our money, like you was just talking about our money, like the all-seeing eye on the back in the pyramid.
Can't you make them like the Twin Towers too, or something like that? Like someone like folds a dollar a weird way, and it was like show the Twin Towers or something like that.
Yes, my little brother does that all the time.
I haven't heard that one before.
Part of me wants to be able to understand the thought process of people who believe these really extreme things. But then again, I know there's probably not much logic in it. And if there is any, it's very flawed and very misguided.
Let me tell you guys a funny story. When I was teaching at WVU, you would think that this would happen to me teaching at Southern, but no, this happened to me when I was teaching at WVU. Right, I had a crazy guy. It was English 101 class. Like pitched a research topic to me once. We had this conversation in my office too. Like imagine me trying to keep a straight face during all this. Right? He pitched the topic. This was the summer semester, I think. He pitched the topic to me. The rapture is going to happen in October this year because the Pope is visiting Philadelphia. The Pope's the Antichrist. And the stars told him this. Right? That's what he wanted to do his research paper on. And I was just like, I don't think that's a good idea.
How would he do?
What would he list as his sources? I'd like to see his works cited page.
Like, I don't know what he would.
A side note, me and pretty much the whole school my senior year, as our senior prank, we were going to fake the rapture because we had a very, very religious teacher. We were going to bring an extra pair of clothes. And one minute when she was like in her office, we were going to just leave our clothes in the cafeteria like we'd been eating, and then all go hide in like a couple different rooms and leave her there and make her think that she was left behind in the rapture.
That would have been good.
Great day.
Our senior prank, all we did was we got a bunch of vegetable oil and threw them in hallways and started sliding down the hallways. We got like 11 students got suspended and everything for it.
Well, I feel like I missed out because we didn't do a senior prank that I can remember when I was in school.
My principal's name was Mr. Snyder, so we got a lot of Snyder chips and stuffed them in his vehicle, and it was so funny. We all laughed when he found it. They like fell out of his car. We bought so many.
Oh my gosh. Does anyone know why the Snyder chips aren't for sale in California? It's on every bag of them. It's like not for sale in California.
Let's hear it.
Oh, I have no idea. I was just asking. I wonder about it every time I see one.
Yeah, I'd be curious.
On nation.
They're too liberal out in California.
That's the only thing I can think of. I mean, they're very liberal. Just real quick, I don't want to mention something about how easy it is to fall prey to conspiracy theories, because we've just been discussing how captivating they are, honestly, because we've been discussing this for like 20 minutes, because it's just it's captivating. And if you're more susceptible than others, based on a lot of different things, you can fall prey to them, whether they're real or not.
I know I read one theory that was like, if people are bombarded with like these end of world scenarios and like, the really fear-mongering news and things like that, it makes them even more susceptible to it. And it just puts their mind in a state of stress that really they almost have like breakdowns. And this is the one thing they can cling to, the conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I mean, we can't just make fun of ignorant people for falling to this. There's lots of very educated people who fall for this type of stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of them are schizophrenic, though, because they're very susceptible to it.
Let me, the last 15 minutes, let me get back to the point at hand here for a little bit. So I think I adequately covered the English religious history, right, from Henry VIII up to the Civil War. Eventually, the monarchy was restored. So the whole Civil War was for nothing. Right? The monarchy was restored. But the monarch after that lost a lot of his power, his or her power, right? That we talk about now how the queen and the royal family doesn't have much power, right? It's the parliament, it's the prime minister. That's who holds the power now. But after the Civil War, that pretty much became the norm. But one last thing I wanted to talk about to change the subject from religion is just this idea of the early modern period and the Renaissance. Early modern period, like I told you guys, this whole idea of the Renaissance came to England much later than it did Italy. Right? Italy is where this whole thing started, this rebirth of classical ideas from Greece and Rome. So a lot of these texts, old texts that had been in dusty archives, a lot of them were becoming rediscovered. Maybe the text that the Catholic Church let us rediscover, right? Like I said, imagine all the texts that's just hiding in the Vatican now. Nobody's ever read. Right? But they were being rediscovered. So people started reading Aristotle again. People started reading the Odyssey and the Iliad, and they started reading Greek poetry, Greek drama, and all this stuff, right? Greek philosophy. All this stuff, it's mostly Greek, right? Romans had their own contributions, but the Greeks are who shaped their Western world. All this stuff's being rediscovered, and so art. This is visual art was big in this time period, right? As you guys know, you had the great artists like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, all the Ninja Turtle artists, right? All of them were in this period. So lots of cultural production happening there. There was these city states like Florence, right, where a lot of this stuff started happening. Then eventually, it took about 100 years or so, but eventually this sort of rebirth, this Renaissance spread westward over into France and then eventually into England. Right, so we were a bit late on the uptake, the English. So about the time period of Henry VIII is when a lot of these things were being rediscovered. So Petrarch, we'll spend more. So we'll be back on track Thursday because we'll talk about Petrarch and Wyatt then, okay, mostly. But Petrarch was one of the first great poets in Italy during this Renaissance period. So he lived about 100 years or so before Sir Thomas Wyatt. Yeah, so his poetry, these English nobles and stuff would learn Italian, and then they would be able to finally read these manuscripts. So that's a bit about that. But one of the reasons why these ideas were able to spread is we finally had the creation of the printing press. Right? So the printing press is one of the most significant inventions ever made, right? Because it helped radically accelerate the spread of this culture. So this rebirth of old culture from Greece, right? Suddenly we could mass produce it at a rapid rate. So nobody had to copy down manuscripts anymore, right? You could mass produce them. So the printing press helped spread this, right? Helped spread this culture. So suddenly in England, around the mid 1500s, suddenly now even these ideas were not just relegated to the royal aristocracy class. Suddenly now you even had middle class type of people learning all this old knowledge. So like Shakespeare was a middle class guy, right? He went to a grammar school. In grammar school, they taught you how to read Latin, right? So you would read, you would learn mathematics and all that type of stuff, but you would learn Latin and you would read all these classic literature texts in Latin and stuff like that. So even the middle class audience would have been aware of a lot of this Greek myth, Greek literature, all this type of stuff. So we owe a lot of that to the printing press. Like I said, as we saw with Chaucer, different people in the Middle Ages were aware of this stuff, but they were few and far between, though. Like it had to be people like Chaucer who had a really big education. The Middle Ages, suddenly, this was knowledge that the middle class could get. So, but even talking about the middle class, right? That's something that we didn't really have in the Middle Ages. Right? Over this time period as well, the economy in England started to diversify. Right? We didn't have just royals, peasants, and clergy anymore. Right? We did start having this middle class. So we saw, especially for instance, Europe was becoming a lot more cosmopolitan. The travel networks were becoming easier. We suddenly started seeing these merchants, right, importing goods from other parts of Europe. So things like silk, for instance. You guys know silk mostly comes from like China, right? But the silk trade started. The class systems even started solidifying around stuff like that. Like, for instance, only royals were allowed to wear the color purple, right? Because purple was a very hard color to manufacture, right? The dye in purple. So only the royals were allowed to, like, let's say you're a middle class guy and you could afford to wear purple. It was against the law because only the royals were allowed to wear purple, for instance. So we had the old school social class system, and suddenly we're in a new world, right, where even living in this economy is much more complicated than it used to be several hundred years before. So we have a different, that's one reason why this is called the early modern period as well as the Renaissance, the early modern period, because suddenly we saw a burgeoning world, that's a burgeoning new economy even that was very similar, that gave birth almost to the type of economy we live in today. So the very much this was a world where you could branch out, right? If you were born a peasant, right, you could maybe get to the status of a middle class person, right? So we're suddenly in an age where social stratification started becoming a thing. But even that was without its problems, right? As we'll see in some of this literature we're going to read, like people who try to get to the next social class, right? Oftentimes in this literature we're going to read, they become villains even, right? When we read King Lear, we'll definitely see that. So again, the old school class system versus suddenly you can now advance. What do we do about that? So that's an anxiety that we face. So like I said, I've made this point before, but we can't, like I said, don't call the Middle Ages the Middle Ages, right? Just because there was a lot of intellectual inquiry, but it was just stifled, right? You couldn't have the printing press, right? You didn't have, it was mostly just royal people who got to read this stuff. So that's the main difference. We owe everything to the printing press. Without the printing press, who knows if this stuff would even spread west over to England. So that's another point to take into consideration. One last point is the English started becoming a world power at this time period. Before this, the French held a lot of, and the Spanish especially held a lot of sway over in Europe. But especially with Elizabeth's reign as queen, this is when the English suddenly started becoming proud of themselves. This is a time, this Renaissance period is a time period of great nationalism for the English. One reason being for that was Elizabeth pretty much so wholeheartedly sunk the Spanish Navy, right? You guys know about her defeat of the Spanish Armada, right? The Spanish had this kick-ass navy, right? But the English were able to pretty much take it down. So this was why Spain and England were conflicting and all that. I'd have to refresh myself on. But suddenly now here's this idea that the English are an exceptional people. Right? We can compete with the whole rest of Europe. We've been the people culturally behind the backwoods people, right? So suddenly now we can compete with everybody else. So this helped give birth to a lot of this literature that we're reading. Like one reason why Sir Thomas Wyatt translated Petrarch into English was we can write poetry just as good as them, right? So why not? So yes, nationalism with the English. Sometimes too, these poets and dramatists would also set things over in Italy, right? Lots of times, like when we talk about Shakespeare, we'll talk about, hey, why are some of his plays in Italy? Well, you couldn't really set a play about killing the king in England, right? Because, well, that would make the English royalty worry, right? It might give them ideas, right? So lots of those types of considerations were in the play too.
Now, was this like kind of start of nationalism before they got to their colonialism phase, or did it stem from their nationalism?
Yeah, both. Look, it stemmed from the nationalism for sure. Right? I told you earlier in the class, this was the time period where Elizabeth started, especially trying to colonize the Irish. Right, one of the reasons being religion. Right, but yes, the English becoming these colonial powers. Right, of course, you guys know eventually the English pretty much conquered the world almost. Right, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Right. But this all stemmed, I think it's safe to say that yes, this did stem from this early English nationalism for sure. So that was a lot to cover in one class, like lots of religion, lots of stuff about the development of ideas, printing press, lots of stuff we covered today. So even though we didn't talk lit necessarily, all this stuff's going to be important from here on out. So we will get back to our lit on Wednesday. I asked you guys to read Petrarch and White for today. Maybe just give it a second read for Wednesday, especially look at the poems that are the same thing. You guys might have encountered it the book gives a nice account of how Wyatt translated some of Petrarch's into an English context. But read over the Petrarch ones again. Read over the Wyatt ones. We will talk poems, and poem rules, and all that stuff Wednesday. Okay. And then next week we'll read Shakespeare. After this, we'll be back on schedule again. Okay.
The White one is the Apology for Poetry, correct?
No, don't read Apology for Poetry.
Okay.
Yeah, the Wyatt selections in our book are just a bunch of random poems.
I think they start on page 701. It's in a different book too. It's the second book in the 3-book collection.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
You guys will be fine if you just for this purpose of our discussion, if you just read 667 to 672. Right, that'll give you all the poems you need that we'll talk about on Wednesday. So 667 to 72. That'll give you all the Wyatt poems that are a little bit later in the book. There aren't necessarily sonnets. So these are the direct sonnets you will talk about. 667 to 72.
I got a question for you too. Oh, go ahead.
In addition to the PDF that I gave you about Petrarch, right? So that PDF I gave you, have that handy in addition to 667 to 72. Was a question?
Yes, sir. I stumbled in a couple minutes late. I heard you talking about a poem we was writing here soon. Right. I was just wondering what the details was on that.
Yeah, so once we get done talking about all these different sonnet writers, so both Wyatt and Petrarch, and then Shakespeare next week. After that, there will be an assignment where you write your own poem using one of these rules, the rules of one of these poem writers. It's like you'll get your choice. You'll get a choice between writing about a Shakespearean sonnet. You'll get a choice to write a Petrarchan sonnet. Or you can write an alliterative poem in the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight style. Right, so that'll be the 3 choices that you will get. So the alliterative is a little bit easier, but you got to write more. Right, but the sonnet's a little bit harder, but you write less. So.
And is this coming? You said next week or the week after that?
Yeah, that'll probably be due a little bit after the midterm. But the concepts that we're going over related to that are definitely the next 2 classes after this. Okay. Anything else before we depart for today?
If no one has any more questions, do y'all want to see the culprit of all the disruptive noises from my end?
With the parrot? Yeah.
This time every day, he always screams for attention, no matter what. We've almost had the cops on us because he screams help and let me out.
That's funny. Yeah, he always makes an appearance in our other class on Tuesdays and Thursdays as well.
Always.
All right, guys, that should be it for today. Take care. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. See you next time.